how do you quiz yourself on the verbs, and refer to a video about how to watch Spanish TV to learn Spanish. Okay, so in this I mentioned that so wait, here we go. So it's in my like philosophy of learning Spanish that we don't want to memorize. And what that like means is that when you go through every single like example of something and then repeat that over and over again, what you're doing is you're fundamentally taking logic out of the equation. You're memorizing, right? You're saying, okay, what is this verb or what is this word? This is what it is. Oh, okay, I'll remember that. And then next time you ask yourself that again. Okay, what is this word? Blah, blah, blah. Over and over again until you know the word. But a lot of times, and specifically in language, there's logic behind that. And so in conjugations, when I learn verb conjugations, the way I first did it when I was learning grammar was specifically understanding the rules and concepts and patterns behind the verb conjugations. And so many people will look at like a chart of conjugations on like we'll take hablar because everyone uses that. So you have something like hablar, which means to speak. And you'll see all these different like individual conjugations and they all mean different things. And that scares a lot of people. And so the way I like to learn it is firstly step 0 or like step 1, I guess, before I did the quizzing myself on the verbs, is to just understand how they work, understanding what a verb is, right? A verb is a word that describes an action. And so there's always a pronoun doing a verb, aka a person doing that action. And there's also usually always someone receiving action. And so that's why we have pronouns that do the verb and then we have pronouns that receive the verb, for example. And so it's just understanding those concepts. And then it's understanding regular verbs and how they conjugate. And so that is an example of regular conjugations. And so, or a regular conjugated verb. It doesn't have any irregularities. It's not an irregular verb. And so here you can see that the step 1 is just understanding the regular. How do we conjugate in the regular? And that's just understanding the rules and patterns for those. And so an example of that would be like take off the R and put O. That's how you'd get the present tense for R verbs, right? Very specific rule like that. And so once I've understood how to conjugate every single tense in Spanish, including the subjunctive imperative, or how I like to call it, the mood tense, that's when I move on to practicing vocabulary. And that's what this comment is referring to, where whenever I find a new verb that I don't understand, I like to learn it. And the way I like to learn it is firstly just translating it, finding out what that verb is. So let's say a new verb for me would be, say, comprar, and that means to buy. So if that came up on the practice of transcript training, which is the exercise where you watch native speak, if I was trying to understand this verb, what I would do is I would search it up on this website called SpanishDict.com. You can see it up there, and you can find what the verb actually means. And then here you see all these conjugations. Now, if I've understood the rules behind conjugation correctly, I should be able to know this entire table directly. And so that's when I would cover the screen with my hand and then just quiz myself. Okay, how would I say I buy or I am buying in the present tense in Spanish? I would say compro, and then I check to see if that's the right answer. So in that way, it's you're testing yourself on your ability to conjugate using the high leverage rules that we learned beforehand. Now, afterwards, let's say I discover a verb like decir, which is irregular. It has more irregularities. This is where, like you can see the irregularities are in red. This is where quizzing actually helps, because the irregularities in Spanish, like they sadly do have to be memorized, but not in the same way that you might think. They're not to be memorized in the same way that like the word for carrot should be memorized or the word for door, but rather they're to be memorized in patterns because they reoccur. So if you see, for example, if you look at, say, the preterite, which is I like to call the point in the past, and you see that, okay, it's an ir verb, so erir verbs for the point in the past, you would get rid of the erir and you would put I. So it should be decir, but then you look at it and you realize, oh, it's dije. And then you think, okay, that's an irregularity, you just have to memorize that. But in reality, you go to the next one and you realize that it has the same thing. it has this IJ sort of thing going on. And so you can also see the pattern that it ends in E, and this one ends in iste, and O, and imos, and eron. And those are actually similar to the regular conjugations of other verbs. And so all you do is just assume that, okay, if I thought it was desi, but it was dije, I can maybe assume that the U informal might be something like, I don't know, dijaste, dijiste, dijeste, whatever. And then based on that, you realize that, take my hand on the screen and then see if I got it right. And so, yes, you have to memorize these. And so it's essentially that you memorize the irregularities, but you also have, it's about being cognizant of the fact that those irregularities reoccur across several verbs. And so if irregularities have regularities or patterns, they're not truly irregular, are they? And so, for example, estar is another example of an irregular verb. And it's being very slow right now. I'll just get rid of it. So estar is another example of that, and its preterite is estuve, which is irregular. But for tener, which is to have, it is also very similar. It's tuve for the I form. And so we have estuve and tuve. And so even though they're completely different verbs and they're both considered irregular, they both are very similar, aren't they? And so you can almost categorize irregular verbs. And so that's how I quiz myself on verbs. It is learning the patterns for regular verbs beforehand, and then quizzing myself on the irregularities, and then trying to find similarities and patterns between verbs and their conjugations so that I can categorize the irregularities and therefore have to do less memorization in total. I hope that made sense.